In a forgotten corner of America, where struggle is ordinary and hope is rare, one man's last chance to survive becomes a miracle he was never meant to find. James Carter, a hard-working man with a sick mother and an empty wallet, buys an old rusted car for a handful of dollars. But when the grime fades beneath his hands, what he discovers inside will change everything. A single spark of gold becomes a flood of temptation. A miracle of metal becomes a test of faith. As greed, fear, and destiny collide, James must choose to be consumed by his fortune or redeemed by it. From the shadows of poverty to the light of redemption comes a story about faith, morality, and the price of miracles. The first light of morning crept through the blinds of the small apartment, laying a thin stripe of gold across the cracked kitchen table. The hum of an old refrigerator filled the silence, accompanied by the steady ticking of a clock that hung slightly crooked on the wall. James sat at the table, staring at a pile of unpaid bills, a small bottle of pills, and a mug of weak coffee that had already gone cold. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, the kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from a life that had been too heavy for too long. Outside, the sound of sirens echoed distantly through the streets of Atlanta, a city that never seemed to stop breathing, even when its people could barely afford to. He picked up the pill bottle, read the label as if it might say something different this morning, and placed it down again with a sigh. His mother's medication 30 tablets that cost more than his week's wages. He had counted them last night. There were 7 left. The doctors had said her condition could be managed if she continued treatment, but the treatment cost money, and money had become a language he no longer spoke fluently. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was the hospital, a reminder that the bill for his mother's last visit was still unpaid. The woman on the other end was polite, but there was something mechanical in her tone, as though she had made the same call 100 times already that morning. James thanked her, promised he'd bring something by the end of the week, and hung up. He sat there for a moment longer, the phone still in his hand, staring at the dull reflection of his face in the dark screen. He drank the coffee in one gulp, wincing at the bitterness, then grabbed his jacket and lunch bag. The day had to start whether he wanted it to or not. Down on the street, the air was already heavy with the scent of car exhaust and fried food from the diner across the road. He caught the bus as he did every morning, sitting by the window, his eyes fixed on the gray buildings that passed by in slow rhythm. The city was waking up, and with it came the constant shuffle of people trying to survive one more day. An older man sat beside him, a friendly face he'd seen before. The man drove delivery trucks and liked to talk. "You still walk into work every day?" he asked. James nodded. "Man, you ought to get yourself a car. A real one, even if it's old. Save you a lot of time." James smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Working on it," he said. The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Working on it. That's what we all say, brother." The ride took an hour. The bus rattled through neighborhoods where the paint peeled off wooden houses, past parking lots full of cars that had seen better years, and finally stopped near the construction site. James stepped off, adjusted his worn boots, and walked toward the gate where his supervisor waited, clipboard in hand. The man barely looked at him, just handed over a helmet and pointed toward the scaffolding. The workday began like all the others, heavy lifting, shouting, the clang of metal, and the sting of sweat in his eyes. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, burning down through the dust. James's hands were covered with small cuts. His muscles ached, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of his mother lying in her bed back home, pale and tired, pretending to be strong so he wouldn't worry. He imagined her smile, the way she'd squeeze his hand and tell him that everything would be fine, even when they both knew it might not be. At lunch, he sat apart from the others, counting his money. After paying rent, utilities, and groceries, there wasn't enough left. There never was. He looked at the photograph he kept in his wallet, a faded picture of his mother taken years ago, before she got sick. Her eyes still sparkled then. He wondered when he had last seen her smile like that. When his phone rang again that afternoon, he didn't want to answer. It was the pharmacy this time. The price of her next refill had gone up. James listened quietly, thanked the voice, and hung up before the ache in his chest could turn to anger. The world didn't stop for anyone. When the shift ended, he stayed a little longer to help clean up the site. The extra few dollars he'd get for overtime might buy another meal, another day of medicine. As he left, the sky was turning a dull orange, the city wrapped in a haze of dust and exhaust. He stopped by the small grocery store on the corner, picked up bread, milk, and a few cans of soup. At the register, he hesitated before pulling out his wallet, counting each dollar carefully. The cashier looked at him with a tired expression. She'd seen plenty of men like him. The paper bag tore on the walk home. The carton of milk spilled onto the pavement, forming a pale puddle at his feet. James crouched down, staring at it as if it were something sacred that had been taken from him. Then he laughed softly, a broken, humorless sound, and whispered to himself, "Figures." He picked up the remaining groceries and walked on, the soles of his boots scraping against the cracked sidewalk. At home, his mother was awake, sitting up in bed, knitting with trembling fingers. "You're late," she said gently. "Long day," he replied. He kissed her forehead, trying to hide his exhaustion behind a smile. She looked at him for a long moment, reading his face the way only mothers can. "You're worrying again," she said. "Worry doesn't heal anything." He sat beside her and nodded. "I know." But he didn't stop worrying. After she fell asleep, James sat alone in the kitchen. The sound of the refrigerator filled the silence again. He opened his phone and scrolled through online listings, looking for used cars. Most were too expensive. Some were barely cheaper than his rent. But then he saw one. Old Chevy, run sometimes, needs work. Cheap. The price was so low that he frowned, wondering if it was a joke. The listing had a single blurry photo, an old rusted car parked behind a shed. The caption read, "She's old, but she's got a soul." He saved the ad and leaned back in his chair. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was desperate. But the idea began to grow inside him. If he could buy a car, even a broken one, he could stop paying for bus rides, pick up side jobs, maybe drive a few deliveries. It wouldn't be much, but it might be enough to make a difference. The next morning came too soon. He woke before dawn, his decision already made. The city outside was still half asleep, the streetlights humming softly. As he tied his boots, he looked once more at the photograph of his mother and whispered, "Just a little more time, Mama. I'll fix this, I promise." On the way to work, he called the number from the ad. The voice that answered was rough and slow, like an old engine that hadn't been started in years. "Yeah, still got it," the man said. "If you've got cash, come take a look." James told him he'd be there after his shift. That evening, as the sun went down behind the rooftops, he walked toward the bus stop again, but this time with a spark of purpose in his step. He didn't know that this decision, the simple act of buying an old rusted car, would change his life in a way he could never have imagined. As the bus rolled out toward the edge of the city, James watched the buildings thin out and the open land stretch before him. The light of dusk spilled across the road, painting everything in shades of bronze and shadow. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe luck wasn't finished with him yet. The city disappeared behind him, and somewhere in that vast distance, a new story waited to begin. The road to the outskirts of the city stretched like a ribbon of fading asphalt, winding through tired warehouses and forgotten lots. James sat quietly on the bus, holding the address scribbled on a folded receipt, his callous thumb rubbing the ink as if it might rub away his doubts. The memory of his mother's soft breathing that morning lingered in his mind. She had been asleep when he left, her face pale against the pillow, her hand resting near the bottle of pills that was nearly empty. He had whispered goodbye, though she couldn't hear him, promising silently that he would find a way. And now, as the city's hum fell behind, he was following that promise down this cracked and lonely road. The bus dropped him off near a row of rusting fences and half-collapsed sheds. Beyond them, the air smelled of old oil and wet dust. A hand-painted sign nailed to a post read, "Cars cheap, ask for Walter." James followed the dirt path until he reached a yard filled with what looked like the bones of automobiles. Faded hoods leaned against walls, broken windshields glittered in the sun, and rows of tires sat stacked like forgotten monuments. A dog barked somewhere behind the fence, and then a voice called out, rough and slow, You the one called about the Chevy? James turned to see a man in greasy overalls stepping out from behind a pile of junk metal. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with deep lines in his face and a cigarette clinging to his lips. He wiped his hands on a rag that looked as old as the cars around him. Yeah, James said, trying to sound confident. I'm here for the Chevy. The man nodded toward the back of the lot. She's back there. Ain't much to look at, but she runs. Most days. They walked between rows of wrecks until they reached a small patch of shade under an old oak tree. There it was, a once blue Chevrolet that had long surrendered its color to rust and time. Its front bumper sagged, the windshield was cloudy, and the tires looked more like fossils than rubber. Yet as James looked closer, something about it drew him in. Maybe it was the shape, strong even beneath the decay, or maybe it was the idea that this forgotten machine might still have some fight left in it. Walter leaned against the hood, the metal creaking beneath his weight. Bought her from an estate sale, he said. Belonged to some old guy out in the country. Don't know much else. Tried starting her up last week. She coughed a bit, then quit. Needs a new battery, probably some fuel line work, but she's solid underneath. He tapped the fender, and a flake of rust fell like dust. Well, mostly solid. James crouched beside the car, running his fingers over the rough surface. The paint came off in orange streaks. He looked under the hood, saw a maze of wires, tubes, and grease. He didn't know much about engines, but he knew enough to recognize neglect when he saw it. Still, he felt a strange sense of possibility. How much, he asked. Walter named a price so low that James blinked, thinking he'd misheard. You serious? He said. The man shrugged. She's been sitting here for years. Takes up space. If you can get her off my lot, she's yours. For a moment, James hesitated. He thought of the last of his savings, the bills waiting at home, the pills he needed to buy. This was foolish, he knew that. Yet something in him whispered that this was the kind of foolishness that might save him. I'll take it, he said finally. Walter spat into the dirt, nodded, and went inside the shack to get the paperwork. The dog barked again as James walked around the car, tracing its shape with his eyes. There was beauty buried deep in the decay, like a memory that refused to die. When Walter returned with a few faded forms, James signed where he was told, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet yard. The old man handed him the keys, a small, dull pair with a faded leather tag. She's all yours now, he said. Good luck, kid. You'll need it. James pushed the door open. It groaned in protest. The seat springs poked through the fabric. The steering wheel was cracked, and the smell of old leather and dust filled the air. He sat for a moment, gripping the wheel, trying to imagine what this car must have been like when it was new, when it was someone's pride instead of a burden. Then he turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled into a shaky rumble that felt more alive than he expected. Walter laughed. See? Told you she's still got a bit of soul. James smiled for the first time that day. The sound was rough, uneven, but it was a start. He let the engine run a minute longer, then shut it off and stepped out. I'll be back tomorrow, he said. Need to pick up a battery, maybe some cleaner. Walter waved a hand. Take your time. She ain't going nowhere. The ride back to the city felt different. James kept replaying the moment the engine caught the small spark of life from something that should have been dead. It gave him hope, foolish or not. When he got home, his mother was awake, sitting by the window with a blanket over her legs. You look tired, she said. I bought a car, he told her. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. A car? An old one, he said quickly. But it runs. I'll fix it up. It'll save us money. Maybe even help me find more work. She studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Your father would have liked that, she said softly. He always believed in second chances. That night, James couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the city outside the sirens, the barking dogs, the distant rumble of traffic. In his mind, he kept hearing the sound of the Chevy's engine, that uneven rhythm that somehow felt like a heartbeat. He imagined it gleaming again, carrying him to work, carrying his mother to the doctor. He imagined freedom, small but real. The next day after his shift, he stopped by a discount auto shop. The smell of rubber and oil filled the air as he picked out a used battery, a few cans of cleaner, and some tools he didn't quite know how to use yet. The clerk rang them up without much interest. "You working on something old?" he asked. "Something like that," James said. "Well," the man replied, "old things got a way of surprising you if you treat 'em right." By the time he reached Walter's lot again, the sun was low, painting everything in shades of copper and shadow. The car sat where he'd left it, patient, silent. He wiped the dust off the windshield, replaced the battery, and turned the key. This time the engine started faster, the sound a bit steadier. He laughed aloud, startling even himself. He took it for a short drive around the yard, feeling every shudder and bump. The brakes squealed, the steering was stiff, but the wind through the open window felt like victory. When he pulled back in front of the shack, Walter stood watching, a grin breaking across his face. "Didn't think she'd move that smooth," the old man said. "Guess you got lucky." "Maybe," James replied, shutting off the engine. But deep inside, it didn't feel like luck. It felt like the world had offered him a hand for once, and he was ready to grab it. The drive home that night was slow and cautious. The headlights were dim, and the wipers barely worked, but the Chevy held together. The city lights greeted him like old friends as he pulled into the narrow alley behind his building. A few neighbors peeked through their windows, curious. "Nice ride," someone shouted. James smiled, too tired to explain that the car wasn't really nice at all. Just alive, and for now that was enough. He parked it near the back fence, shut off the engine, and sat in the dark cabin for a while. The air smelled of old metal and gasoline. His hands rested on the steering wheel, feeling the lingering warmth of motion. Somewhere in his chest, hope began to stir again, fragile but real. When he finally went upstairs, his mother was asleep. The small lamp beside her bed cast a soft glow over her face. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then whispered, "It's going to be all right, Mama, I promise." Outside, the night air was cool, and the city hummed with life. Down below, the old Chevy waited quietly, its body rusted, its soul unbroken. James couldn't know it yet, but that car, ugly, battered, and forgotten, carried a secret more valuable than anything he had ever dreamed of. And as he closed his eyes, exhausted but content, the promise of tomorrow seemed a little less impossible. The morning after James brought the car home, the sun rose pale and low, sending thin beams of light through the narrow alleyway behind his building. The air smelled of dew and rust, and the city's usual noise had not yet awakened in full. The old Chevy sat there, its metal body catching the light in patches of dull bronze and orange. James stood at his window for a long time before going down, holding a cup of coffee and staring at the car that had somehow become a symbol of his stubborn hope. It looked as if it had been sitting there for 100 years, as though time had forgotten it. Yet he felt a strange affection toward it, a bond that didn't quite make sense. Maybe because it was broken, like him. Maybe because, like him, it still ran when it shouldn't have. He finished his coffee and went downstairs. The morning air was cool against his skin. As he approached the Chevy, he could see how much work it would take to make it truly usable. The body was covered with a layer of grime and a film of oil that turned to paste under his fingertips. The tires were flat, cracked along the edges, and the chrome had long since lost its shine. He grabbed a rag and a bucket of water and began to clean, humming softly to himself. Every now and then, a neighbor would pass by on their way to work, offering a nod or a quick word of encouragement. "She's a beauty," one man called, though it was said with a kind of amused pity. James only smiled. They didn't see what he saw. By noon, his arms ached and his shirt clung to him with sweat. He stepped back to look at his progress. The old Chevy looked a little better, the windshield now clear, the sides streaked with marks where the rust had thinned. It wasn't much, but it was something. He crouched beside the front wheel, scrubbing at the rubber, when his brush caught on something that felt different. It wasn't just the texture of old rubber. It was harder, heavier. He frowned, pressing the edge of his thumb against it. The sunlight hit the spot just right, and for a brief moment, something glimmered faintly through the dirt. He blinked, thinking it was just water reflecting light. But when he rubbed again, the shimmer remained. Gold. The thought was so absurd that he almost laughed out loud. He scratched a little more, revealing a patch no bigger than a coin. It gleamed unmistakably, the deep, warm hue that couldn't be faked by paint or chrome. His breath caught in his throat. He reached for a screwdriver, scraping carefully at the edge of the tire, expecting to find paint underneath. But the more he scraped, the more the metallic surface revealed itself smooth and unmistakably real. He stopped, staring at it, feeling the world tilt slightly beneath him. For a full minute, he just crouched there, motionless, the sound of his heartbeat loud in his ears. His mind raced through a dozen explanations, maybe some kind of novelty finish, a trick, a joke. He leaned closer and tapped it with the handle of the screwdriver. The sound it made was wrong for rubber, too heavy, too solid. He scratched again, then again, and the gleam grew wider, spreading like sunlight through clouds. He dropped the tool and sat back, staring at it. The tire, at least this one, was gold. Not painted, not plated, but solid gold. He laughed then, a disbelieving, hollow laugh that echoed through the alley. It couldn't be. No one would make a car with golden tires. It was impossible. And yet, as he pressed his palm against it, feeling the cold, smooth surface, there was no denying what his eyes told him. He stood up quickly, looking around as if the world might be watching, as if someone would leap from behind a dumpster to claim it. But the alley was empty, and only the distant hum of traffic answered him. He ran his hand through his hair, breathing hard, his thoughts a storm of confusion and awe. His first impulse was to convince himself it was nothing. Just a strange alloy, maybe brass, maybe something left over from a repair job decades ago. But curiosity was stronger. He fetched an old pocket knife from his kitchen drawer, came back down, and scraped at the metal again. A small curl of gold came loose, soft and bright even in the dim light. He held it in his palm, turning it over. Gold, no question now. His stomach twisted. If even one tire was gold, what was the rest of the car made of? The thought sent a tremor through him. He stood for a long while, the knife dangling from his hand, before he crouched down again and began to test the edges of the wheel well. The paint peeled away in flakes, and beneath it, the same rich, yellow sheen glowed through. He moved to the door, scraping along the edge. The same. He checked the handle, the frame, the bolts that held the mirror everywhere he touched. The rust seemed to hide something brighter beneath. The discovery spread like fire through his veins, a mixture of fear and wonder. He couldn't stop. It was as if he were peeling away the skin of the world to reveal the truth underneath. Hours passed without him noticing. By the time the sun began to dip behind the rooftops, the car's body was marred with small streaks of exposed gold that gleamed in the fading light. It was beautiful and terrifying. He sat back on the ground, his hands trembling, his breath uneven. His mind was full of questions with no answers. Who could have made such a thing? Why had it been left to rot? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do with it? He thought of his mother then, the hospital bills, the nights she lay awake, coughing, whispering prayers under her breath. He thought of the fear he felt each time the phone rang, and for the first time in months he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to pay every debt, to give her the care she deserved. The idea hit him like lightning. This car could change everything. It could save her life. It could save both of them. But with that thought came another, darker one. What if someone found out? He wiped the sweat from his face and looked around the alley again. He needed to be careful. He couldn't tell anyone, not even his friends at work. Not Walter, not the neighbors, no one. He dragged an old tarp from the shed and covered the car completely, tucking the corners tight against the wheels. It looked now like any other abandoned vehicle, just another piece of junk waiting for time to finish its work. Inside his apartment, the air felt heavy. His mother was asleep, her breathing steady but shallow. He stood by the window, watching the tarp flutter slightly in the wind. Every sound outside made him tense. The bark of a dog, the rumble of a truck, footsteps on the pavement. He felt as though he were guarding a secret too large for one man to hold. His mind raced with possibilities. Should he sell a piece? But how? He couldn't just walk into a pawn shop with a chunk of gold the size of his fist. He'd need proof, papers, explanations. And if the wrong person got suspicious, he shivered. Sleep came late that night, and when it did, it was uneasy. He dreamed of the car gleaming under a harsh light, crowds of people reaching for it, voices shouting, cameras flashing. He dreamed of running through dark streets, clutching a handful of gold, and of his mother calling his name from somewhere far away. When he woke, the sheets were tangled, and his heart was pounding. The room was still dark. He got up and went to the window again. The tarp was still there, unmoved, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something enormous had shifted in his world. The next day, he called in sick to work. He spent the morning pacing the apartment, then finally went downstairs again. He peeled back the tarp, revealing the car's dull form. The sun caught the exposed streaks of gold, and for a moment, it looked as if the car were glowing from within. He ran his hand over the metal, feeling its warmth. "Why me?" he whispered. The question echoed softly, unanswered. He thought of the old man who had sold it to him, Walter's shrug, the way he'd said, "She's got a soul." Maybe the man had known something, or maybe he had simply been blind to the treasure sitting in his own yard. By midday, James had made up his mind. He took a small flake of gold from the edge of the door, wrapped it carefully in tissue, and put it in his pocket. He would take it to a jeweler, ask for an evaluation, pretend it was something he found on the street. He needed to be sure before he did anything else. As he left, he glanced back at the car one more time. The tarp fluttered slightly as if the machine were breathing beneath it. He shivered and turned away. The jeweler, a man with sharp eyes and silver hair, examined the piece under a magnifying glass. "Where did you get this?" he asked casually, but there was something in his tone that made James's stomach twist. "Found it," he said, "on a job site." The man nodded slowly, weighed the flake on a scale, and scribbled something on a notepad. "It's pure," he said finally. 24 carats. High quality, too. Not jewelry scrap industrial, maybe. Strange find." He handed it back. "You could sell it. Small piece like this worth a few hundred, maybe. But if you've got more," he smiled faintly, "well, you might have yourself a fortune." The word echoed in James's head as he walked home. Fortune. He had never had a fortune, never even dreamed of one. And now it sat in the alley behind his building, hidden under a tarp, waiting. But as he turned the corner onto his street, the feeling of triumph was tempered by something else, a heaviness, a quiet fear. The kind that comes from knowing that the line between blessing and curse is thinner than it seems. That night he stood by the car again, the city lights reflecting faintly off the tarp. His hand rested on the hood through the fabric, and he whispered to himself, "I'll figure this out. I'll do it right." He didn't yet know how, but for the first time in years, the world no longer felt like a closed door. It felt like something vast and golden, waiting to be uncovered, if he could find the courage to keep digging. The days that followed were unlike any James had ever lived. The old car sat quietly behind his building, hidden beneath its weathered tarp, and yet its presence seemed to fill every corner of his mind. He couldn't walk through his apartment without feeling its weight pressing against him, couldn't sleep without dreaming of its gleam beneath the layers of rust. Each morning when he left for work, he hesitated on the back steps, his eyes lingering on that silent form, half afraid that someone might discover it while he was gone, half afraid that it might somehow vanish if he looked away too long. It was as if he were living with a secret too large for the world to hold. At work, he moved like a man in a trance. His hands went through the motions, lifting, stacking, hammering, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in an endless loop of calculations and fears. The value of gold, the weight of the car, the hospital bills, his mother's medication. He found himself watching the faces around him, wondering if they could see it in him, the knowledge of something impossible, something that could change everything. No one noticed, though a few men commented on how quiet he'd become. "You all right, James?" they'd ask, and he'd nod, forcing a smile. "Just tired," he'd say, and that wasn't a lie. The secret was heavy, and it was making him tired in ways he'd never felt before. One night, after his mother had gone to sleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the flake of gold he'd brought to the jeweler. It lay there under the weak light, catching every glimmer that passed across it. He couldn't stop staring at it, his fingers tracing the smooth edge. The jeweler's words echoed in his head. "You might have yourself a fortune." The phrase seemed to mock him now, A fortune, 2 syllables that could lift a man or destroy him. He had never been close to wealth before, had never even thought about it beyond the basic hope of having enough to survive, and now suddenly it was right there in front of him, and he had no idea what to do with it. He thought of his mother's voice the night before, soft and trembling. "James, we'll manage. We always do." He'd smiled and told her she didn't need to worry anymore, but she had only looked at him with that old knowing gaze that mothers have. "Be careful, son," she'd said. "Sometimes what we think is a blessing is just another kind of test." At the time, her words had felt distant, like something out of one of the Bible verses she loved to quote, but now they rang sharp and clear. The next morning, he called his supervisor and said he wouldn't be coming in. He had somewhere to go, somewhere he hadn't been since he was a boy. The church sat on a quiet corner, the paint faded, the steeple leaning a little under the weight of the years. Inside, it smelled of dust and candle wax. Pastor Green was there, a tall man with kind eyes and the sort of calm that made people confess things without meaning to. When he saw James, his face softened with recognition. "It's been a while, son," he said, motioning for him to sit. For a long time, James didn't speak. He stared at the cross above the altar, the sunlight cutting across it in pale stripes. Finally, he said, "I think God gave me something, Pastor, but I don't know if it's a gift or a trap." The pastor didn't interrupt, just waited. So James told him not everything, not the details about gold tires or hidden treasure, but enough. Enough for the old man to understand the weight of it. When he was finished, the church was quiet except for the faint creak of the wooden pews. Pastor Green folded his hands. "James, sometimes the Lord gives us things not to keep, but to see what we'll do with them. Blessings can be tools, or they can be chains. It depends on the heart that holds them." He leaned forward slightly. "The question isn't what you found, it's what you plan to do with it." James sat there for a long time after that, staring at the floor, listening to the faint buzz of a fly trapped near a window. When he finally looked up, there was a strange calm in his chest. "I just want to help my mother," he said. "That's all." The pastor nodded. "Then start there. Use what you need. Don't let greed take root. That's how men lose their souls." That night, James worked late into the evening, carefully removing small pieces of gold from areas of the car that wouldn't be noticed: the inside of the trunk, the underside of the doors, the bolts that held the bumper. Each piece he wrapped in cloth and hid in a box beneath his bed. His hands trembled the entire time. The act felt almost criminal, like he was defiling something sacred, and yet he couldn't stop. The gold seemed endless, the weight of it frightening in its promise. The next day, he went to a reputable pawn shop across town. The owner was a cautious man with a sharp jaw and a habit of tapping his pen when he thought. James presented one small piece, pretending he had found it during a demolition job. The man tested it, nodded, and handed over a stack of bills that made James's throat tighten. It was enough to pay for his mother's treatment for several months. He left the shop feeling lightheaded, the money in his pocket burning like fire. He went straight to the clinic, where the nurse behind the counter looked at him in surprise as he paid the overdue bills in full. "Are you sure?" she asked. "That's a lot of money." He nodded. "I'm sure." She smiled then, her voice softening. "You just gave your mother a real chance." Those words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time in years, he walked out of that building with something other than guilt weighing on him. When he got home, his mother was sitting up in bed, her eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. "You look different," she said. "Lighter." He smiled and sat beside her. "I took care of the hospital bills, Mama. You don't have to worry anymore." She looked at him for a long moment, and tears filled her eyes. "James, how?" He hesitated, then said, "I found some old things from the past. They were worth something." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Promise me you'll be careful. Money changes people, even the good ones." He swallowed hard and nodded. Days passed and his mother began to improve. The new medications helped, her appetite returned, and she even began to hum again as she used to when he was a child. The apartment felt lighter, filled with small laughter and the smell of warm food. But for all the joy that bloomed inside their home, the secret behind the building continued to grow heavier. Every night after she went to sleep, James would sit by the window, staring down at the covered car. The moonlight would catch the faint outlines beneath the tarp, and he'd wonder if he had made the right choice by keeping it hidden. He began to plan, to think bigger than just survival. What if he could help others like himself? Families struggling with hospital bills, children who needed medicine, people who worked hard and still couldn't make ends meet. The idea came to him slowly, like dawn creeping over the horizon. He didn't want to become another man corrupted by greed. He wanted to be the kind of man his mother believed him to be. One evening, he went back to the church. The pastor greeted him warmly, and James explained his plan: to use part of his newfound wealth to create a small charity fund, something that could quietly help those in need without drawing attention. The pastor listened, nodding thoughtfully. "That's a noble thing, James, but you must build it right. No shortcuts, no secrets that can rot from the inside. Do everything clean, everything honest. That's how blessings grow instead of decay." Over the following weeks, James met with a local accountant recommended by the pastor, a kind woman who helped him set up legitimate channels. He sold small amounts of gold discreetly, always through legal means, and each transaction was documented. The money went into an account that would fund medical expenses for struggling families. He worked in silence, never boasting, never taking more than he needed. But the more he gave, the more the strange sense of awe and unease deepened. The gold seemed to have no end. It was as if the car itself were an endless vein of light, a gift too vast for one man to own. Sometimes he caught himself staring at it, wondering if it was even real. There were moments when it felt alive, when the soft gleam beneath the tarp pulsed faintly in the night like a heartbeat. He shook those thoughts away, telling himself it was only his imagination. Yet in quiet moments he remembered his mother's words. "Be careful what you call a blessing." The temptation to take more always lingered. He could have bought a better apartment, a new car, a life of ease. But each time he imagined it, he saw his mother's face, heard the pastor's voice, and forced himself to stop. Instead, he focused on doing what good he could, staying small, staying invisible. He had learned long ago that attention was dangerous, especially for a man like him. And yet, despite his efforts, the whispers began. Neighbors noticed that the hospital bills had been paid. The pastor mentioned his donations in passing, praising his generosity. People began to look at him differently, not unkindly, but with curiosity. He started to feel eyes on him when he walked down the street. The world, it seemed, was beginning to take notice. Late one night, as he sat alone in the kitchen, James realized the truth of what his mother and the pastor had said. The gold wasn't just a gift, it was a test. It was testing his patience, his integrity, his faith. And the hardest part of that test wasn't resisting greed. It was learning how to carry the weight of something extraordinary while still living an ordinary life. He glanced at the clock. Past midnight. Outside, the city hummed softly, and from the alley came the faint rustle of wind against the tarp. He stood, opened the window, and looked down at the shadowed form of the car. "You're not mine," he whispered. "You were never mine." The words brought a strange peace to his heart. He would keep caring for his mother, keep helping others, but he would never let the gold own him. For the first time in a long time, he slept deeply. The weight in his chest eased. The next morning, he woke to the sound of his mother humming in the kitchen, the smell of coffee drifting through the apartment. He smiled, realizing that sometimes the truest wealth isn't what lies hidden under rust and metal, but what's alive within the people we love. And though he didn't know it yet, the gold would continue to test him, to pull at him, but it would also shape him into something far greater than fortune ever could. Morning came with a quiet peace that James had not felt in years. The air that drifted through the window was cool and fragrant, with the smell of wet pavement after a night's rain. His mother was already awake, humming softly in the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. The sound of her voice, so steady and warm, filled the small apartment with life. James lay still for a moment, listening. It had been months since he'd heard her sing. That small melody, simple and imperfect, meant more to him than any treasure hidden beneath rust and dirt. When he finally rose, he found her standing by the stove, her face flushed with health, the faint smile of contentment softening her features. She looked up and saw him in the doorway. "You're up early," she said, her eyes bright. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, smiling. "You sound good, Mama." She laughed lightly. "That's because I feel good. Better than I have in a long while. Whatever you're doing, James, it's working." He nodded but didn't answer. There were no words big enough for what he felt in that moment. Gratitude, relief, fear, they all mixed inside him like layers of paint, forming something deeper, something almost holy. After breakfast, he stepped outside into the quiet street. The clouds were breaking, and sunlight spilled across the rooftops. The tarp over the Chevy gleamed faintly with moisture. He approached it, brushing away beads of rain, and for a moment he thought he saw the outline of gold glimmer faintly beneath the fabric. It no longer filled him with the feverish excitement it once had. Now it seemed like a sleeping giant, something to respect but not awaken. He touched the edge of the tarp gently, as one might lay a hand on the shoulder of an old friend. "You've done enough," he murmured. "You gave us more than we ever deserved." Then he straightened and turned away. There were better ways to honor a miracle than by clinging to it. Over the following weeks, the rhythm of life began to change. James worked fewer hours at the construction site, spending more time organizing what had quietly become a real foundation. He called it the Second Chance Fund. The name came to him one night while watching his mother sleep, her chest rising and falling steadily for the first time in months. It was simple and true. He registered the foundation legally, hired an accountant to keep it clean and transparent, and partnered with a few clinics in the neighborhood. The first families they helped were people he knew by sight, workers from the site, cashiers, janitors, mothers balancing two jobs. He would never forget the first time he handed a nurse the payment for a child's surgery. The woman had wept openly, clutching his hands, and all he could say was, "Someone once helped me. I'm just returning the favor." He meant it. The gold funded everything quietly. James sold small, carefully measured portions over time, never too much at once, always through official channels. He took nothing for himself beyond what was necessary for his mother's care in their modest life. The apartment remained the same, the furniture old but comfortable, the meals simple. He drove no luxury car, wore no expensive clothes. He had learned that peace comes not from abundance, but from balance. His name began to appear occasionally in local papers, though he never granted interviews. People called him generous, even saintly, but James always brushed it off. "I'm not rich," he told them truthfully, "just lucky enough to share what I have." His mother grew stronger with each passing month. She began to help him with the foundation, reading letters from families, writing replies in her elegant, careful script. Sometimes she'd look up and say, "Do you realize what you've done, James?" He would shake his head. "No, Mama. What we've done." Her eyes would fill with pride. "Your father would be proud," she said one evening, her voice trembling. "He always said a man's worth isn't measured by what he keeps, but by what he gives away." Those words stayed with him. The old Chevy remained in its place behind the building. James had repainted it once, not to disguise it, but to preserve it. The new paint was a deep matte gray, humble and clean. He'd replaced the windshield, fixed the mirrors, and polished the interior until it shone. The golden glint beneath the surface was still there, but he kept it hidden, as though the car were a secret between him and the divine. He drove it sometimes, not for errands or show, but for long, quiet drives through the outskirts of the city. On those drives, he thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the wonder, the transformation. The car no longer felt like a possession. It felt like a promise fulfilled, a living reminder that even in rust and ruin, beauty and meaning could be found. Years seemed to pass in a rhythm of purpose. The foundation grew. Small donations began to come from others' neighbors, churches, even local businesses. People wanted to be part of something that made sense, something that helped without judgment. James often found himself surprised by the goodness of others, by how quickly kindness could spread once it found fertile ground. His name became known, though he never sought fame. When journalists asked for interviews, he politely declined. "The work speaks for itself," he said, and it did. Families were healed, homes rebuilt, futures restored, all seeded by a miracle he never claimed as his own. Yet even in success, there were moments of quiet conflict. Some nights he sat by the window staring at the car, the gold still gleaming faintly in memory. He wondered what would happen if he told the truth, if he revealed the impossible story behind his wealth. But he knew what that would bring: questions, disbelief, greed. People would not see the gift as sacred. They would tear it apart to own a piece of it. So he kept the secret locked within him, sharing it only in silent prayer. He no longer asked, "Why me?" Now he simply said, "Thank you." As time went on, whispers began to circle through the neighborhood. People spoke of the man with the golden car. Some said he had found treasure, others that he'd inherited money from a long-lost relative. No one knew the truth, and James made no effort to correct them. Let them tell their stories, he thought. My truth belongs to me. It comforted him that the legend had taken a life of its own. It meant that what had once been his burden had become something larger, almost mythic, free of his control. One evening, he and his mother sat on the small balcony outside their apartment, watching the sunset wash the sky in shades of orange and rose. She wore a shawl he'd bought her last Christmas, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked suddenly. "The car?" He nodded. "Every day." She smiled faintly. "You ever wish things had turned out differently?" He thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "No, I think it turned out exactly the way it was meant to." She reached over and took his hand. "That's how I know you've passed the test," she said. "Not everyone could have." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out at the horizon, where the last sliver of sun dipped below the rooftops, casting the world in gentle twilight. As darkness fell, James felt the familiar restlessness that came before his late drives. After helping his mother inside, he went down to the alley, uncovering the Chevy. The metal caught the last traces of sunset, and for a moment it looked almost alive. He climbed in, turned the key, and the engine came to life with a deep, steady hum. The city streets were quiet that night, the air clear and still. He drove without destination, letting the road choose for him. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on the pavement lulled his thoughts into something like meditation. He passed closed shops, glowing streetlights, the faint reflection of neon signs and puddles. The world seemed softer, less cruel. He thought about the men he'd worked with, the faces of the children his foundation had helped, the doctors who had treated his mother, all of them in some way connected to the same thread that began with a rusted car. The realization filled him with a deep, quiet joy. The miracle hadn't been the gold, it had been the chance to do something good with it. When he reached the open road beyond the city, he slowed down and rolled down the window. The wind was cool against his face, the stars hung high above, and the moon cast a pale shimmer across the fields. He pulled over to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and sat in silence. The world was vast and still. He looked at the car, the faint glow of the dashboard lights reflecting in his eyes. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the interior shine with a soft, golden hue, as though the metal were breathing again. He smiled. "I know," he whispered. "I understand now." When he finally drove back home, the sky had begun to pale with the first light of dawn. He parked the car and stood for a long moment, looking at it. Then on impulse, he took a small bolt from the glove compartment, one he'd saved years ago, a piece of unpainted gold from the car's original frame. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its weight. It was small, but it seemed to hold everything he had learned: patience, humility, faith. He placed it gently in the bar of the dashboard, where it would stay, a quiet reminder of how easily fortune could turn to folly and how beauty could hide beneath decay. His mother was waiting at the door when he climbed the stairs. "Out for another one of your drives?" she asked, smiling. He nodded. "You know me." She shook her head fondly. "One day, that old car will outlive us both." He grinned. "Maybe it already has." She laughed softly, and he thought her laughter sounded like home. Years later, when people would speak of James, they called him the man who turned luck into kindness. Some said he was a miracle worker, others a fool who gave too much. But those who knew him best said simply that he was a man who once found something precious and decided the world needed it more than he did. The Chevy remained parked behind his home until the end of his days, its true nature hidden from everyone but him. Sometimes when the sun struck it just right, it would glow faintly, like a memory of light. Children passing by would stop and stare, whispering that the car was made of gold. Their parents would laugh and shake their heads, but somewhere deep down, they wondered if it might be true. And perhaps it was. For even long after James was gone, when the foundation he built continued to help the sick, the poor, and the hopeless, the old car still sat quietly beneath the sky, gleaming faintly beneath its gray paint. On clear evenings as the sun sank low, it caught the light in such a way that it looked, for one brief, breathtaking moment, like a vehicle made entirely of gold. And if one listened closely, then, through the hush of twilight and the whisper of wind across metal, one might almost hear a voice, gentle and content, saying, "Thank you." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. There are more incredible stories waiting for you. Just click on the next video right here. And if this tale touched you, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the smallest moment can change everything.